We'll go ahead and get started here. My name is Tony Mills. I'm a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute and director of our Center for Technology, Science, and Energy. Thank you for joining us in person and those of you who are joining us online for this important and timely conversation about federal research and development in the age of global competition. After many years of enjoying great economic success, brought about in large part by its leading position in the international markets, the United States now faces serious challenges abroad. Changing dynamics in the international marketplace, as well as deliberate actions by some governments in restraint of free trade, have combined to diminish the competitiveness of many American goods and services. This challenge to America's competitive standing in the international economy has stimulated a reevaluation of U.S. policies on several fronts. Indeed, it has prompted a reevaluation of basic questions concerning the role of the public sector itself in fostering economic growth, technological advance, and sectoral and regional development. So wrote former AEI President William Baruti Jr. in the preface to a 1986 volume on industrial policy published by AEI Press and edited by my colleague Claude Barfield, who will be joining us on stage later this afternoon. History does not repeat, of course, but it does rhyme. And today we find ourselves at a similar inflection point, with fierce global competition and shifting political alignments prompting deep questions about the role of the state in science, innovation, and industry. Questions that call for careful analysis and thoughtful reflection. Perhaps no one today is better positioned to help us think through these questions than Dr. Arati Prabhakar. And on behalf of AEI and the Center for Technology, Science, and Energy, it is my pleasure and honor to welcome her here at AEI this morning. Dr. Prabhakar is the director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and assistant to the President for Science and Technology. In this capacity, she is the President's chief advisor for science and technology, a member of the President's cabinet, and co-chair of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. An applied physicist by training, Dr. Prabhakar has, during her distinguished career, led two different federal R&D agencies prior to taking the lead at OSTP. DARPA, the storied Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, as well as NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. She has also worked with startups, large companies, universities, government labs, and nonprofits across a wide variety of sectors, including a 15-year stint in Silicon Valley as company executive and venture capitalist. Welcome, Dr. Prabhakar, and thank you for being here. Joining Dr. Prabhakar on stage this morning is my colleague, Chris Miller, an associate professor at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, where his research focuses on technology, geopolitics, economics, international affairs, and Russia. Chris is also the author of the New York Times bestselling book, Chip War, The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology, which was awarded the 2022 Financial Times Business Book of the Year Award, as well as the Council on Foreign Relations Arthur Ross Book Award. Before handing it over to Chris, I wanted to invite everyone here to please stick around after the conversation for a terrific panel conversation that will provide further context and analysis on the role of federal R&D in today's changing policy landscape. Thank you again for joining us, and without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Chris.
Well, thank you, Tony, and thank you, Arati, for joining us today. There's a whole lot of topics I'd like to cover, and I'd like to also find time for Q&A at the end of our discussion. But perhaps to start, can you help us understand how you arrived in your current position? Tony laid out all of the different roles that you played in different parts of the R&D ecosystem in the government and the private sector. Can you lay out your career steps that led you to the Office of Science and Technology Policy to start our conversation?
Sure. It's great to be here with you, Chris, and thank you for the warm welcome, Tony. I really appreciate this is such an important topic, so I'm glad we get to talk about this. My story in Washington started 40 years ago this fall. I came as on a congressional fellowship. I'd just gotten a PhD in applied physics in semiconductors, which is the topic that you and I usually talk about. We're going to be broader today. And I came because I wanted to work on things that had more impact than I thought I could have just burrowing in on one topic in a lab. And from there, I had a chance to go to DARPA as a program manager early in my career. And now I'm at a point where I've had these 4 decades, half public service, half private sector, most of that Silicon Valley, all of that Silicon Valley, most of that venture capital. And I'll tell you what I saw in that 40-year journey was the fact that this country does enormous things. Think about the information age that we have brought to fruition. Think more recently about mRNA vaccines. Huge things get done, and those huge things get done because the public and the private sectors each play their part. And that was really the perspective I had when a couple of summers ago, the White House called and the president asked if I would come to this role at OSTP. And I was delighted to have that opportunity because it's one of the very few places where you actually have the opportunity to work on that entire innovation system and understand how those linkages reinforce each other. And we are at a time when we have so many huge things that we want to do as a country. Our ambitions are as big as they've ever been. So I think it is absolutely a time when this phenomenal innovation capacity that we have has to be brought to bear. So that's why I'm where I am.
Well, fantastic. And I'd love to hear over that 40-year period when you've been watching and playing a role in many key aspects of the R&D ecosystem. What's changed? How do things look different today?
I'll tell you, I loved where Tony started, that quote from, I think it was 1986. That's about those 40 years. And we have been admiring some of the hard problems that we have about and trying to sort out the role that government and industry need to play in the flourishing of the American economy in a time when global competition is changing so dramatically. And I'll tell you, I am so proud of what this president and this vice president have gotten done, because on multiple fronts now, we are finally taking the kind of action that is going to change the trajectory. And that a lot of it is about taking the huge advances in science and technology and turning them into the impact that really changes Americans' lives. That's true whether it's the Inflation Reduction Act and moving out on clean energy deployment to deal with the climate crisis, the first really significant action that anyone anywhere has taken that's actually going to change the climate trajectory. It's true on semiconductors, where we have talked for all 40 years that I've been involved in the semiconductor world. We have talked about the fact that semiconductor technology has globalized and then gotten very dangerously concentrated in just one part of the world. Now, in this administration, we're taking action with the CHIPS and Science Act, and that has taken us from a trajectory where we were going to continue to have 0% of the most leading manufacturing in semiconductors here in the US to now the Semiconductor Industry Association's estimate is, I think, 28% of global leading manufacturing capacity in the next decade. And that's how you start changing what those prospects look like.
And you noted the importance of having a clear definition of what the job is of the public sector and what the job is of the private sector. How has that balance changed as well over the past couple of decades, or has it changed?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we are coming through a period where for many years we had what I would tell you were oversimplified assumptions that globalization solves all problems, that the market solves all problems. Globalization and market forces, a lot of things happened. Many of them were good. They certainly did not solve all of the country's problems. And it led us to a place where we had fragile supply chains, as we saw during the pandemic, a place where we have a degree of income inequality that is really dangerous and damaging and hurting our country, driving polarization, a hollowing out of many regions of our country. And these are things that matter to our success as a nation, but aren't the things that the market or globalization will just magically fix by themselves. And I think what is so important in the approach in this administration is to recognize that the answer is not to sweep all of that away, but rather to partner with industry and to do together. Public and private sectors need to do together what we can't do separately. And so just to stick with the CHIPS example to start with, that's a case where Congress, the president really made this a huge priority. In the summer of 2022, Congress passed the CHIPS and Science Act, and that allocated $52 billion. The majority of that is manufacturing incentives to make sure that we brought leading edge manufacturing back to the United States. Today, over $400 billion of private capital has stepped up to the table, and it is because of this catalytic effect of a public commitment. And that I think really exemplifies how a public investment and a clear message that this country cares about an industry that is foundational to our economy, our supply chains, all the jobs that supports, and to our military capabilities. Once you say that's important and that we're going to invest as a public entity in that area, I think it has this huge effect on how private capital is allocated, and that's what it looks like when the public and private sectors pull together to change the course that's ahead for the country.
And does that represent a shift in our thinking? In the past, I think you could argue we differentiated between R&D and manufacturing, and now we're realizing that actually for a lot of advanced manufacturing, it's really impossible to separate from R&D. Is that a fair?
Yes, and it's not just manufacturing, but it's really all the ways, if you think about the purpose of research and development is to change the options that you have, change the possibilities that you have ahead. But once it creates those new possibilities, once those advances become within the realm of the feasible, then you actually have to implement them, and that can be manufacturing, it can be other kinds of businesses, all of which feeds into the economy. It can also be about how you make wiser decisions about regulation, about the functioning of government, and the provision of government services. So I think we need to understand that its role is broader than just manufacturing, or even just broader than feeding the economy. But ultimately, it doesn't matter if you don't translate it into that impact. And just as I think we had an oversimplified model in which the market or globalization was going to solve everything, and we've realized that we have to refine it in an important way. In research, we had an oversimplified model that was, if we just do the basic research, all good things will happen. And in fact, that's not how the world works. And with the structural shifts that have happened, with the rise of global competition, with the internal shifts, with corporate R&D really declining, much more entrepreneurship, a much more effective and engaged academic community. Those shifts all now mean that we have to pay much more deliberate attention, not just to seeding basic research, but to making sure that it just doesn't sit on a shelf. And I think that's reflected in these very tangible ways, as we're talking about with clean energy, with semiconductors, other advanced manufacturing, but also in the research that we're doing today. For example, the National Science Foundation started the first new directorate in 3 decades. It's the Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships Directorate. And one of its clear goals is to try to catalyze regional economic development, recognizing that we can't simply go on having beautiful university research across the country, but not connecting it, not letting it be harnessed by local economic opportunities that communities can really pull together.
Well, I'd love to get back to the question of corporate R&D and ways that's changed, but maybe first on the question of translation from a scientist to a business, or from lab to fab in the semiconductor case. What's the right way to do translation? You've been a venture capitalist, you've worked at DARPA. Who does translation the best, or how should we think about the right models for that type of translation?
Well, first of all, it's always hard. People talk about the valley of death. A lot of things need to die because they actually might seem tantalizing in the lab, but they don't work in the real world. So I think you just have to recognize that it's hard. If you're in the R&D business, it's inherent in your world that you're going to come up with things that seem cool, but are just breathtakingly hard to translate into impact. And by the way, the more revolutionary your research result is, what disruptive means is it's going to break things for people. And so actually some of the biggest advances are the hardest to implement. I think back in the DARPA history, stealth technology, which is just completely obvious that you want your aircraft to be almost invisible on enemy radar, that idea was fought so fiercely by the Air Force until it was forced on them, and then it worked and it saved lives, and now of course they can't imagine not having it. So I think it really gets to this idea that you have to try for the biggest, most disruptive changes, and yet you just have to recognize that it changes so many things for anyone who's going to use it. So that's why it's hard. Where I think there are places where I think it's actually gotten better in the US. So if you think about universities, a number of decades ago, universities, I would say, even engineering departments were much more isolated from the corporate world, and often didn't think that they should get their hands dirty, that they should remain, pure and untouched by what the market might do. That change today, I think, is dramatic. And Bayh-Dole legislation a number of decades ago is one of the real, I think, important factors there. But today, the ability of universities to both provide technology and research results to license and otherwise get it into industry is much better, and the ability to start new businesses is something that's much richer. So I think that's in my mind, that's something that's gotten better. Corporate R&D, many industries that did a lot more corporate R&D have really shifted to much more near-term product development. I think that's a trend that in general goes the other direction.
Well, let's dig into that, because I think if you look at the history of R&D, institutions like Bell Labs loom very large, and for half a century was producing Nobel Prize after Nobel Prize. Why don't we have an equivalent to Bell Labs today?
That was a monopoly. That's what paid for all of that R&D. And I'll tell you, Bell Labs put me through graduate school. It was right before divestiture. It was sort of that last shout of that era of Ma Bell. And I remain grateful for that, but also you can't not be impressed by all the goodness that came out of that. It was Nobel Prizes, but it was also, it was the transistor, right? So it was some things that really were the beginning of massive changes that happened. But I think we also need to recognize that the innovation that came after Ma Bell was broken up was something that wasn't going to happen in the old monopoly, right? I remember my colleagues at Bell Labs were all about voice quality, and they couldn't imagine the world we live in now, in which we carry around cell phones and a world that is built on a foundation of the internet. I mean, that's so contrary to what this old model was. So, my view is that you need a mix. You need organizations that are very, very, very good at further refining what they do today, and there's innovation to be had there. But you also need organizations that are just completely blowing up the current paradigm and seeding things that could be as dramatic a change as the internet was for communications.
Well, and I guess I'd agree with your argument that corporations today tend to do more D than R. They're interested in more short-term tweaking products rather than taking 20-year-long bets like Bell Labs did. And I think there's obviously exceptions to that rule,
Definitely,
but I think it probably is the rule. What does that imply about the role of either universities or foundations or government in filling that gap?
Yeah, I think let's take a look at what the innovation system looks like. First of all, I want to put it in a global context. We in America still spend more than any other country in the world on research and development. The latest numbers were something in the vicinity of $800 billion a year. We recently hit 3.5% of GDP, which is the largest percentage we've ever spent of our GDP. That has been driven by phenomenal growth in industry R&D. That's grown much faster than GDP. You can see the intensification of the innovation economy, the information economy in particular. And that is where some of the really interesting new research is coming out of industry, especially in areas like AI today. So I think that is part of the good news in America's competitive position. Of course, the important news in global R&D is China, because the People's Republic of China, in a period in which we doubled R&D spending in the United States, 25 years during which we doubled our spending in real terms, China's spending in R&D grew 27-fold, right? They went from not really part of the global scene to now number 2, only behind us in total spend, 40% more than what all of Europe put together spends on R&D. It's so hard to get your head around how massive that investment is. And very strong continued investment by the government in their public R&D. They recently announced that they were going to increase government spending in R&D 10%, notably including a 13% increase in basic research. So, this model that China just copies and follows that is not the whole story at all today. Because once you start manufacturing and building your development capability, that's what allows you then to really build a robust research base, and that is definitely happening. So we are still very, very strong, but we are no longer alone. That's why R&D has been such a priority for this president. And he was able to, again, the big growth in the US has been private sector R&D. Federal R&D has bounced around and stayed level as a share of GDP, plus or minus a little bit, for quite a long time now. It has certainly not kept pace. It's not kept up with the scale at which our economy has grown. And much more importantly, it hasn't kept pace with the scale of our ambitions, because we've got big things we need to do on areas like climate and changing American health outcomes and creating economic opportunities in the industries of the future. We're not really keeping up to that. The president made it an important priority. He was able to get increases in federal R&D that were about 24% in the first couple of years of this administration. And then, of course, that ran into the Republican budget caps on Capitol Hill, and that growth flattened out. So that is a great concern to me because of China's rise, because of how AI is such a disruptive force today that's going to require investment to get it right and to use it to do the country's work. But most fundamentally because American R&D does not thrive unless we have the federal component to lay this foundation of basic research, to educate the students that are going to feed into all of these industries, to do the basic research that feeds industry, but also feeds all of our public missions that the government is responsible for, fully responsible, of course, for national security, but also critical roles in energy and the energy transition, in space, in dealing with the environment, in agriculture, and many other areas. So that's the work that I think still has to get done. I think it's so powerful and there's so much promise, but we have to get serious again about making sure that it keeps up with the scale of the great ambitions we have.
Well, I think the description, the international picture that you lay out is striking, and especially the role of Europe. I hadn't really put that number in context before, but it's quite shocking. I'd love to hear how you think about relations with allies when it comes to R&D, because of course there's in the chip space and the AI space, there's a lot of conversations right now about working with Japan or Korea or Taiwan or our European friends. What's the substance there? How effective are those efforts?
I think they're critical. And as this president and vice president rebuilt our strong alliances around the world, science and technology engagements have been integral to that. That's true when we are addressing a critical sector like semiconductors, where we were clear from the beginning that part of what we wanted to do was to make sure that the critical components we need for supply chains and for the military have a good, strong footprint in the United States. But this was never about, rolling up the fences, rolling up the sidewalks, and just doing everything here. And so the role of our all of our allies and partners around the world has been key in the strategy and thinking about semiconductors, and I think those have been very good, strengthening relationships there. And then it's equally true on the R&D side. So when I meet with my counterparts at the G7 or in the Five Eyes community, we've spent a lot of time working on shared issues of climate and health, on how we approach AI to make sure that we wrangle it and manage the risks, but seize all the tremendous benefits.
And you mentioned Five Eyes, so perhaps we can segue to national security, which is in some ways, I think, many of the key R&D programs have their origins in national security concerns. Since the end of the Cold War, there's been less investment in national security across the board. That might not be changing as the international picture, I think, darkens in a pretty substantial way. What are the types of R&D investments that are today necessary for national security, and are we making them?
Yeah. Well, I'll reflect back on my time when I was leading DARPA, because that is always the core question when you are the agency that's responsible for creating breakthroughs for national security. And I will tell you that I think by definition, the mix of what we invested in had to change. And in the time that I was there, we were focused on what does it mean that commercial technology is available around the world, and we don't get to be the only people who have electronics and advanced communications and now AI. We focused on how to harness the next generation of the information revolution, including AI. This was a decade ago, but most people in the science and tech world, AI did not just appear a couple of years ago. There's been a lot going on for a long time there. And then we were always looking for where there were new horizons of research that were going to have huge implications for national security. And I'll tell you my favorite story about that. I showed up as director at DARPA in 2012. I had been gone for 19 years, so I had a little catching up to do. I was getting acquainted with my program managers, and one of them was an infectious disease doc, a geneticist, and an Air Force colonel, because that's who you have at DARPA. And he said, this is 2012, he said, there's going to be another pandemic. All the conditions are ripe. And one of the problems is that we don't know how to make a vaccine that works in fewer than years or decades or sometimes never. But there is this really interesting research in mRNA, and it might be the basis for a rapid response vaccine platform. Now, in 2024, that seems obvious. In 2012, that was crazy talk. I mean, people literally told, the word naive, I think, got used a few times, right, by people who really knew about vaccines. Dan persevered. He told me that first meeting, he said, I just met this little startup in Boston. It's called Moderna, and they're using mRNA approaches, but they're going after cancer, which, you know, as a former venture capitalist, I thought, yeah, I'd go after cancer too. Unfortunately, you can always count on that market. You can't actually count on the infectious disease market. Lately, it seems like a good bet, but back then it didn't seem like a good bet. And Dan said, I think we might be able to persuade them to work on infectious disease. And thank goodness we did, because it took a lot of people doing miraculous things for us to actually have mRNA vaccines and other vaccines as quickly and as effectively as we were able to get. But the reason that Moderna was able to ship vaccines for clinical trials within a few short weeks of NIH identifying the stabilized spike protein that the vaccine needed to produce, the reason that happened so quickly was because Dan and DARPA had that kind of foresight. So I think it's a great example of first understanding national security in a broader context that reflects today's realities, and then secondly, it gets right back to what government and industry do together that you can't do separately.
And so for every decade of its history, DARPA has a story like that.
That's actually the job description. A former DARPA director, Craig Fields, once told me that DARPA gets all of this resource and all this support, which is actually, both of those are important. That's why DARPA works. And he said all you have to do is do 1 to 2 things per decade that fully change the way the future unfolds.
So I think DARPA is one of the probably pretty few institutions around this town that has almost unanimous support in terms of its accomplishments, in part because of that track record. Yeah. It's a better track record than I think many venture capital firms have, to be sure.
Different business, to be clear.
Different business model, different business model. So what explains that success? Because it seems to me if we could learn the key to that success and replicate it, we'd have a whole lot more successful R&D. Yeah.
Well, first of all, there are enormous successes that happen across the federal R&D enterprise. DARPA is in the business of going for high impact and being able to take high risk in order to reach for high impact. And that's why when it succeeds, its successes are so dramatic. But I think it's important to recognize that it builds on top of this foundation of basic research that is laid by NSF and by NIH and by other parts of the Defense Department and the basic research that it supports. Because none of these big breakthroughs happen in isolation. So I think you have to recognize that, and you have to recognize the partnerships that DARPA itself forms, not just with universities, but with companies and throughout the defense enterprise as well for the more military focused objectives. But, you know, core to, given that, with that big caveat that it exists in a bigger ecosystem, I really felt when I was leading DARPA that I had the great privilege of building on 6 decades of a successful history that bought for me the confidence of all of my bosses in the Pentagon, literally all the way up. All my bosses up to the president understood how important DARPA was, that its mission required that they not meddle. I had bosses who made sure other people didn't meddle, but made sure that we had the room to run, and then put the onus on us to produce results and to really, I had bosses who pushed me to make sure we were reaching far enough, but did not micromanage, did not get in there and tell us what their pet projects were. And I think it's very hard to find any organization, public or private, by the way, that gets that kind of rope, but you have to give people that kind of rope if you want to go big.
Well, I think the other interesting part about DARPA is that assessing success or failure comes after a decade, in the mRNA case, for example. And I guess that points to another challenge about assessing R&D in general. How do you know when it's working?
Yeah, it's not a business where you get to tell on a quarterly basis if you are making your numbers. And in fact, I think that's one of the word that gets used a lot is what are the metrics? And I think if you're in the R&D business, everything you can measure is going to not tell you much, actually. And so I always focus on assessment. So number one, you are aiming for huge impact in the future. Whenever you're doing R&D, your ultimate impact is going to be in a future that is too far out for you to manage on a day-to-day basis. And the art of R&D management is figuring out how to tell whether you are on track to that goal, or sometimes a different, even better goal, because again, it's R&D, it might open up new prospects, and figuring out what can you observe in real time. So when you're managing a DARPA program, what you're looking for is, are the teams coming together and are they working constructively? Are they hitting interim milestones? Is the research that they're generating really vibrant and exciting and interesting, or is it, pretty incremental? And then that's what you steer by. You stop the things that aren't working. It's very active management. Stop the stuff that's not working. You go push on the things that are working and accelerate them. That's how you manage day to day. You work with the users to see if you can persuade them to pick this stuff up. And when they, famously, they often start off hostile because it's such a crazy idea. But eventually, they have to go from hostile to at least just skeptical so that they'll tell you what really has to happen. And then eventually, like with the mRNA vaccine case, a really important moment was when we proved enough that NIH said, oh yeah, we need to partner with Moderna and start moving it into the real world. So that's what those steps look like. And I think, again, we're talking about DARPA, but President Biden started the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, recognizing that that kind of high impact orientation was something we needed to bring to the challenge of health outcomes for Americans. And taking those methodologies and adapting them to a very different set of issues, different science-based, different technology issues, very different ways that you achieve impact. But I think there are many elements of that model that with ARPA-E for energy and now ARPA-H have been successfully adapted, which is great to see.
Well, I guess that points to a question of how easily can we scale our R&D infrastructure?
Yeah.
You've called for spending more. Are we sure that our marginal dollar will be as useful as the existing dollars that are spent? How do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I think we're in deficit right now, and so I think we have got to do some fixing. I'll just start with one. The thing that is really boring to everyone, but has to happen, which is making sure we've got facilities and infrastructure that work. Like I go out to NIST where I was director now 30 years ago, and I used to walk up to that building with such pride because it represented the scientific prowess that we have. And it's been under construction for a long time because they can't finish the construction because we can't seem to get construction dollars appropriated to really keep these facilities going. And it's not just NIST, it's many other places. So we've got to do some of those foundational things. And then it's time for us to go big with the possibilities that science and technology really bring us. And I'll use AI as an example because I think it is today it is the most powerful technology that's shaping opportunities. This administration has done a lot of work to get AI on the right track. The president and the vice president seized that generative AI moment that happened starting about a year and a half ago, a couple of years ago, to say we have to manage its risks so that we can, so that we can harness its benefits. And we've done a lot to get on a better track in terms of managing risks of safety and security and bias and discrimination and privacy. And I think there's more to be done there. But I've really been eager to turn our focus now to the second part, which is how are we going to use it to go big? And when I talk to my colleagues in the tech industry, they for sure are looking at every possible business opportunity that's about productivity and enhancing the way we do all kinds of work. And as long as they do that responsibly, that is going to be great for the country. I want to see that happen. But there are things that we need to use AI for that aren't just for things that the market's going to drive. They are for public missions. They're really doing the country's work. And I'm thinking here about how we design and approve drugs. I'm thinking about how we close educational gaps for our kids, which we've been trying to do for a long time, have not really made the kind of progress we need. I'm talking about how we deliver better weather forecasts. Think about what's going on right this minute with these climate exacerbated weather extremes that we are seeing right now. Think about the safety of our transportation infrastructure. Think about how the government delivers its services to its citizens. We can see these tantalizing prospects for how AI can transform each of those areas, but those are all going to take serious investment in R&D, and I think that, to me, that really points to the reason to get federal R&D on a healthy track is not just to compete with China effectively. It's not just to make sure that we keep the R&D base healthy. It's so that we can go big and do these things.
Well, I'd like to open up to questions in just a couple of minutes, but you've discussed AI. We discussed semiconductors. Biotechnology, I think, is another area of focus. We'd love to hear your thoughts on how you think about that very large area, what the priorities are when it comes to R&D.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you start with the term biotechnology for a couple of decades now has meant pharmaceuticals because it was a new way to build drugs that were really effective. There, we have an industry that's well underway, and there are critical supply chain issues that need to get addressed there for the long-term health of that industry. But that core technology of using biology to synthesize new chemicals and materials is now something that actually, as those capabilities have expanded, there are interesting prospects well beyond pharmaceuticals that are really tantalizing. When I was at DARPA, we had a synthetic biology program. I remember the program manager came in and he said, there's a future where the Air Force, instead of pouring a runway, could grow a runway. Imagine a biological process that harvests the materials that are in this place you've just landed in, and actually can build something of that structural capacity. Well, that's actually something we've proven you can do now, and there's some efforts to try to build that out. But it just sort of gives you a sense of how much more biology can do, and where we are today. And this was the focus of an executive order that the president signed a couple of years ago now. In order to make sure that America leads in this area, what I don't want to do here is the playbook we've done many times, which is we do beautiful research and then someone else commercializes it, and then we don't have the manufacturing capacity here. So one of the areas that we have focused on is building the bioprocess scale-up capacity, so that we not only know how to do beautiful things in the lab, but we can actually start showing what scale-up looks like to vet out the process side so that it can then be commercialized much more rapidly.
I guess it's another great example of the need to combine R&D efforts with supply chain analysis at the same time.
You have to look at the whole picture. That's exactly right, yeah.
Well, let me see if we have any questions from the audience. Please, sir.
Hi, good afternoon. My name's Todd Wiggins. I have a quick question since I'm late, but I heard you talk about health and combining AI. So I wanted to apply it to cancer, because that seems like that's been a long-running issue, and there's so many different types of cancer, and we still don't have something beyond the traditional chemotherapy and immunotherapy to circumvent the various cancers. So can we apply to that? I think that would be a celebratory day for everyone if we could come up with something.
I am with you. President Biden started the Cancer Moonshot when he was vice president, and he and the First Lady reignited it a couple of years ago. You know this is personal for them, having lost a son to cancer, but they know cancer is personal for every person in America, but around the world, who's untouched by this horrible problem. And the goal that they set when they reignited the Cancer Moonshot, the quantitative goal was to double the rate of progress that we've been making and to cut the age-adjusted cancer death rate in half over 25 years. That would be 4 million lives saved from cancer deaths in that time period. So that is a huge deal. And I have been thrilled to see Danielle Carnival, who's part of my team at OSTP, is the leader of the Cancer Moonshot. I've been thrilled to see her approach it not just as an area for more research, but an area where we are putting in place the regulations that will prevent new cases of cancer, for example, from PFAS and other contaminants. Doing the work of screening and early detection so that we can nip cancers in the bud. Americans missed 10 million cancer screenings during 2020 because of the pandemic. We've regained that, and we've gotten screening out to many, many, many more people, including people who were who didn't have health insurance, didn't have primary care. We're making progress on that. And therapies, making sure the therapies that exist are affordable and reached by more people, but also that the new therapies can come to the fore. And very much to your point about using AI, there are so many possibilities. I'll mention one, which is ARPA-H has a program that's using AI to look at approved therapies and discerning which of those might be good candidates for rare diseases, including rare cancers, which are very difficult, very challenging to get specific therapies for. But mapping known safe and effective treatments for other diseases looks like a very high potential way to accelerate treatments for rare diseases.
Claude.
Hi, Claude Barfield with AEI. In decades past, the Washington policy community, the science policy community, has obsessed with the role of the science advisor and the relationship of the science advisor to the president, to the rest of the apparatus. How has that role changed? If you look back at the Bushes or Clinton or even Obama, how has the role of the science advisor changed, if it has, over the past decades?
I find that the role of the science advisor is really shaped by who the president is, number one. And what I had the great privilege of coming into this role and working for a president who has always seen science and technology as, this is a president who loves to talk about how America is a country that can be defined in a single word, and that word is possibilities. And that's what he sees when he looks at our science and technology enterprise. So he's always been a great supporter of science and technology for all of its myriad applications and purposes. Everything from how it changes health outcomes, to how it creates economic opportunity, to how it, just part of being a great nation is understanding how the universe was shaped and pursuing the boundaries of fundamental knowledge. And he has always appreciated all of those. So that's made it really great fun to be in this role. A lot of my time in this administration has been shaped by the fact that ChatGPT showed up about a month after I showed up in this job. So a lot of my direct interactions with the president have focused on artificial intelligence, including the great fun of showing him ChatGPT and image generators early on. This is like a year and a half ago. That was a session that kicked off a lot of the AI work. And because I think his approach, both he and the vice president really saw AI as bringing both promise and peril. And so they've really approached it from the perspective of being aggressive about going after risks, but also making sure that we are laying the groundwork so that we can seize the opportunities. And so that's been one of the areas of tremendous focus in my interactions with him.
Okay. Thank you for both being here. It's fabulous discussion. Chris, I hope you choose to write a follow-up to Chip War, perhaps a Chip War 2.0. That would be terrific.
Chip Peace. Can we have Chip Peace?
Yeah,
What do you
that's
think?
a better aspiration.
Speaking of semiconductors, I'm curious. Because of the Chips and Science Act, a lot of the billions of dollars that have been allocated to Intel. And Intel, as you know, has had some challenges. And I'm just kind of curious if you were working with Intel, or if you could offer advice to Intel, what type of advice and guidance might you offer to have Intel challenge other types of semiconductor companies?
Well, I don't think I'm in a good position to give advice to Intel. I will say that if you look at what the CHIPS Act is getting done, I mentioned the important shift from 0% of advanced node manufacturing in the US to getting to 28% over a decade. What that represents is not one single company, but now we are on track to have the 5 leading edge manufacturers from around the world have operations, manufacturing and production operations here in the United States. And that to me is what is really significant, is that cohort as a group. No other nation has more than 2, and putting us on a path where we have all 5 of those, I think gets to the kind of robustness and the position that we really are seeking to get to.
In the back.
Hi, Andrew Reamer, research public policy professor at George Washington University, and the last remaining member of the Carter administration's industrial policy sleeper cell.
Wow, that's
because
a story.
In 1980, the Carter administration was in the process of coming up with an industrial strategy that would have been implemented except for the election. So I got into the business of doing industrial strategy at the regional level, probably 200 projects. And so the question has to do with the interaction, the collaboration between the public sector and the private sector, and how that gets done. Because right now the CHIPS Act, the way the government's used to working now is through rules. And the CHIPS Act is all about the rules. To be eligible for this, you need meet the following criteria. But there's nothing about business-government collaboration. And the high point of business-government collaboration, maybe Chris knows this, was under the esteemed Commerce Secretary of the 1920s, Herbert Hoover, who had an industrial strategy and set up mechanisms for business-government collaboration that all happened to be white, male Anglo-Saxon Protestants, so they were quite comfortable working with each other. But the 2 mechanisms were boards, the remnant of which is in the Commerce Department now, the International Trade Administration, and the other was the Commerce Department setting up trade associations, beginning with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce was created in 1912 by the federal government to be the partner for industrial policy with the Republican federal government. That changed during the New Deal. So this is all a question to how do we set up mechanisms that are transparent and accountable in which government and business come to some mind meld, because it's the private sector that produces the stuff, not the public sector.
I love that history. That was I didn't know pieces of that. That was great. Look, my view is that our economy and the work we're trying to do is it's not single-threaded. It's complex, and you have to break down the goals and then figure out what the nature of the partnership needs to be. So in the case of CHIPS, we were very clear that the country's goal is to make sure that we have the advanced semiconductor manufacturing that we need sufficiently located in the US, and that we have our allied relationships in a way that meets our economic goals and our military goals. That's what the country is trying to get done. And then, of course, every partnership, every arrangement that Secretary Raimondo's Commerce Department is putting in place with each individual company, the company is coming to the table because they have business goals and they find enough shared interest to make something happen. That's the nature of those partnerships. It's a very different kind of partnership when you're doing the kind of R&D that I was describing in some of my DARPA stories. And so I think we need to be open to many different kinds of relationships and arrangements, but all goal-driven, and recognizing that what the partnership represents is the government acting on behalf of what the country needs, and companies acting on behalf of what they need, because they are entities that have their own goals. So I would not look for a cookie cutter. I think it's important to have many, many, many different approaches.
Hi, it's Stuart Buck, Good Science Project. Great to see you, Arati. So word on the street is there's an election coming up pretty soon.
Yeah, how about that?
Yeah, and it's kind of hard to call. So your time at OSDP may or may not be coming to an end in the next 2 or 3 months. So kind of a three-part question, any of which you may or be willing or able to answer or not, as the case may be. But as you look back on your time at OSDP, are there any successes that you would say, this is beyond my wildest imagination, I'm so proud to have achieved this? Number two, is there anything that's kind of at the opposite end where you say, I wish I could have done this, but faced unforeseen obstacles? Again, if you can say. And number three, what do you look forward to doing next?
I have no idea on the third one. I think about 1 and 2 all the time. I mean, that's your day job, right? Is figuring out if you've made any progress and what still needs to be done. I am really proud of what this administration has gotten done to put AI on the right track. Tons more work to be done. But ignoring this powerful technological force that is reshaping society was not a good plan. And I think the fact that we've been active there is something I'm very, very proud of. More globally, I think something that has been a great passion of mine and a reason that I was so excited to have this opportunity is that federal R&D, in my view, is still too much on auto drive from Vannevar Bush and Endless Frontier, which is now nearly 80 years ago. And that was brilliant for its time, but it's too long without really rethinking the roles and purposes of, and the way to accomplish those roles and purposes for the federal R&D enterprise. And I would tell you, I think we've made very important progress in, for example, starting ARPA-H to focus on health outcomes, in starting the new Technology Innovation and Partnerships Directorate at NSF, augmenting the important basic research that we do, but making sure that we're actually aiming the whole enterprise at achieving. Look, the whole contract between the American people and federal R&D is that R&D is going to deliver a better tomorrow for the American people. And I think we've gotten a little bit better at that. And that's a very hard thing to do. So I'm really happy about the progress we've made there. The thing that I regret that I think we have not gotten done, but that this country simply has to do, we have got to go big. And we aren't yet taking as many big shots at really huge opportunities. And part of the reason I'm very excited about AI is I think it is disrupting every area, but if you figure out how to use it and wield it, it can be an enormous accelerator. And I think that is true for our most important societal goals that we've talked about, opening up access to opportunity for every person, economic growth, national security goals, health, dealing with the climate crisis. I think the opportunities are immense. I think this R&D enterprise that we have in this country, public and private, is fully capable, but we have got to aim it and resource it to really achieve the big things that I know are possible.
Could I ask a follow-up there?
Yeah.
In terms of making sure we're going big and achieving the big goals, what's the limiting factor? I mean, you mentioned resources, you mentioned aiming. Obviously, both of those are important, but it would seem that people would agree that going big is better than going small.
Yeah.
So why aren't we going big?
Well, let's talk about what going big would look like. A great example is when the Senate AI leadership group that Majority Leader Schumer put together, they came out with their AI roadmap a little while ago. One of the things that they mentioned was a $32 billion resource for non-defense AI R&D. And I think a lot of people looked at it and said, $32 billion, what would you use that for? Let me put it in context. As a government, we spend close to $200 billion a year on R&D. About half of that is the D part for defense and development, but $200 billion. So $32 billion is about a 15% kicker to that. If you did spend $32 billion on top of what we're currently doing in R&D, that would take federal R&D from about 0.7% of GDP to 0.77% of GDP, right? So it starts moving you in the direction of sufficient federal R&D investment to meet our ambitions. What does it look like on the ground? What it looks like is today we have thousands of known diseases for which there is no treatment, and we generate new pharmaceuticals that address new conditions at the rate of about 20 or 30 a year. So thousands, 20 to 30. If you can speed that up tenfold or 100-fold, think about what that means. That means that my kids might be able to grow up without worrying about dementia at the end of their lives. That's just unbelievable, but it could be possible. It really could be possible. We are doing pieces of the basic research to pursue that. Pharma companies are each taking their own trove of private data and trying to make progress on that. But until we pull all of that together and supercharge it with investment, my kids aren't going to achieve that future. I want them to have that future. We got work to do.
Let's grab one or two final questions, please. Let me grab both of you as our two final questions, then we'll wrap after that.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm Franka Lindner. I'm with the MIT Washington office, and my question would be the influence on China on our national R&D, looking at, especially from an MIT perspective, the international students kind of harnessing the innovation possibilities that their presence on campus bring, but also managing the risks that might appear with IP, looking at China being on the high risk and watch list. How do you see the future, or what R&D has to do, what has to be done?
Yeah. Now, I think this is an issue that has been very challenging for everyone in the research enterprise, and especially universities. It's not that long ago that everyone was being encouraged to build these linkages with Chinese research organizations. And I think the place to start is to recognize that China's behavior has changed over the last 10 or 15 years, and that they have crossed one boundary after another, whether it's militarily, in economic interchanges, or going after intellectual property. And in research in particular, I think that how you deal with that it's been a vexing issue for you, it's been a vexing issue for all of us as well. And we recently put out research security guidance to federal agencies from OSTP to try to wrangle three facts. One is China's aggressive and inappropriate behavior. The second is the fact that basic research, can only thrive with global open communications. And I think that you can't lose that in the process of being less naive about what China is doing. The third factor is at the individual level, which is a core value in this country, is that we don't discriminate against people because of their ethnic backgrounds. And that can't be part of how we deal with this situation. So I think we are getting guidance in place that I hope will make it easier for universities to be just a little bit smarter about how to deal with these issues, while making sure that we treat people right and keep that openness that's so vital for research.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Konstantin Drashek with the American University. Thank you so much for this discussion today. You already talked about the cutting-edge semiconductor fabs being built in the US, which I think is a very big and important step. I am, however, concerned about the things more upstream of those fabs, because they're not much used without the precursory chemicals, the rare earth materials. So do you feel like there's enough attention being paid to that? Thank you.
And I'm sorry, do you mean for example, critical materials?
Yes, exactly. I mean, the cutting-edge fabs, they're pretty much at the end of the production line, right? There's so much going into there, all the chemicals they use, also rare earth materials, as I already mentioned. And so my concern is basically that at some point we build all these great fabs, but might not have the supplies to even run them.
Yeah. No, first of all, critical minerals and critical materials have to be paid attention to. I don't want to be 5 or 10 years down the road saying, I wish we had done something back in the mid-2020s. So I think that's a great example of an area where I think we need to be looking to the future. I'll mention that part of the CHIPS R&D effort that's going on, building on top of what we were talking about with respect to what AI can do, the pressures on advanced materials for the next generation of semiconductors are extraordinary. They're trying to do technically very challenging things to make chips work. They have to worry about supply chains. And a lot of those materials and processes use PFAS and other chemicals that are very, very problematic as we learn more about the health implications. And the regulatory pinch is definitely affecting semiconductor manufacturing today. So that seems like an almost unsolvable problem, but to me it's a perfect example of where really innovative research can make a difference. And so NIST's CHIPS R&D effort recently just launched an initiative that is about using AI first to expand the universe of possible materials and combinations of materials, and then coupling that with autonomous experimentation to much more rapidly drive to practical solutions that can be transitioned into production much more quickly. And I love that because I think when I see an impossible problem, I am itching to find science and technology ways to make that turn into a tractable problem. And if we can do that there, I think it advantages manufacturers remaining and continuing to build in the US, which is the point of the CHIPS R&D effort.
Laura, this has been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you,
for
Chris.
joining us.
Great to be here with you.
That's great. All right, I think we're going to get started pretty fast here. If everybody wants to take your seat. Very quickly, time is the fire in which we burn. It is of the essence. That's a Star Trek line. All right, I want to take your seats. We can get started with our all-star panel. Description I use rarely, but not reluctantly in this case. All right. Close the doors, seal them, lock them. As always, no one's leaving. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming up and staying here for the second of our federal R&D related paneling here. This panel, in case you've gone to the wrong place, is a return of federal research and development, ? Perspectives on science innovation policy. And we have, I think, a super panel. I'm going to start way over there with Claude Barfield, a senior fellow here at AEI. And next to him is Daniel Gross, a professor at the Fuqua School of Business at Duke. And next to him, Will Reinhardt, also a senior fellow at AEI. And next to him is Caleb Watney, co-CEO of Institute for Progress, an organization so dynamic, they need 2 CEOs to wrangle that thing down every day. You got to have a third. Wonderful. This is a topic I love. So happy to be chatting about it. I think it's super timely. But despite the fact that it is wildly timely, we're going to start off, I think, with a little bit of history, which maybe I want to direct initially to Dan and Claude, though everybody can, as with all these questions, you can see a great prep I did with the panel. Everyone's allowed to jump in as you wish. So I'll start with Dan, then I'm going to jump over to Claude. Dan, how did we get here? We're spending, I think, about $200 billion a year federal R&D. That's a lot of money. The government used to not spend a lot of money a long time ago. How did we get from there to here?
How much time do we have?
You got a little bit, but not a lot of it.
Yes, I will try to be a bit concise and precise.
Yes.
And so
we'll go decade by decade here.
Okay, right. We don't even have time for that, my friend. But so to give you some context, a chunk, not all my work has actually examined how World War II is this transformative moment for the U.S. innovation system and U.S. innovation policy, especially. So if you look back about a century ago, the U.S. government didn't have, at that time, the federal government, a heavy hand in supporting research and development outside of agriculture. And there was hands-on work, for example, at some of the military services, Army and Navy research centers, but not a lot of extramurally funded work. And World War II changed all of this. I mean, we had in that kind of cauldron of a crisis, a new approach to R&D policy that was, I wouldn't even say tried on for size, it was kind of brought on by the necessity of the moment. And so you had Vannevar Bush, we already had Arati reference, Bush and the Bush report that came after the war, along with several colleagues, science administrators of that time, create an organization, the Office of Scientific Research and Development, that organized, funded, and led a R&D attack on wartime problems. And so that covered a broad swath of the issues that the war presented, and out of the on the back of that effort was emerged what more or less is the shape of the modern research policy infrastructure we have today. It didn't quite take the form that Bush proposed at the time. Instead, is a bit more fragmented, where you have different organizations supporting different kinds of science towards different ends. But yes, in the 1950s and onwards, you had the NSF created in 1950. Even before then, you had, for example, ONR, the different defense research offices that picked up a lot of what OSRD left behind at the end of the war. The AEC comes around that time, though that's now the Department of Energy and beyond, NASA in the 1960s. And so this portfolio begins to build and expand. But the interesting thing about it, among many things that we can talk about here today, is just how carved out it has become, where you have kind of different organizations with different, in some sense, in science and topic space, jurisdictional boundaries that do intersect and overlap some, but with different mission objectives. And so there's much more we can unpack there. You pull that forward again to the present. A lot of it has more or less remained in place. I actually left at the NIH, another key ingredient of this system. But you put the pieces together, that's the constellation we're more or less working with today. Now, of course, budgets have grown tremendously since then in real terms, but this is where we are at the moment and the path that got us there. And I'll go ahead and pass it over just for the sake of brevity.
Yeah, the only couple of things I would add is, one, I think throughout the entire period since the Second World War, the role of defense and R&D defense has had a large, and security has had a large role. And I think it was certainly one of the, Dan, by the way, sent us a great paper about the beginnings of all this in World War II, which he just went over a little bit. But it came out of really necessities for security. And that was one of the impelling reasons that the federal government stayed involved in this during Cold War. Well, as Dan points out in his paper, into the 1970s. And the second thing is to reemphasize that this is a fragmented system. It does not start from the top and go down to say this is what the nation needs in terms of domestic R&D or national security R&D. It kind of comes up from the top. And third, I would say, while we have the national, we can come back and talk about other things about the National Science Foundation. While the famous Vannevar Bush report made the case for basic research, and then we had the National Science Foundation, which is, I think, the basic institution for federal support of research. NSF has never been the overwhelming force, because other programs, other departments, other agencies have substantial, the DoD, as we've mentioned, and as our speaker talked about quite a bit, with DARPA and others, have a substantial role, and other agencies today, energy, for instance, the Energy Department has a huge R&D role. So while NSF is at the center in some ways, it has never dominated. We have not one agency that has actually set priorities or tried to set priorities. It remains a fragmented system that comes up from the bottom, or comes up, if you will, from responses of individual agencies to the exigencies or priorities of the time. Excuse me.
One more history-related question anybody can answer. One of the most amazing charts I've seen is looking at what we spend as a share of GDP, what we spent at the peak of Apollo in the 60s, which was the peak ever, and then it just kind of went down, 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 some bumps here and there over the decades. And I found that astonishing, because when you talk to economists, they tend to like open trade, they tend to like immigration, and they all tend to think, at least the basic kind of fundamental research, they're all in favor of that. Yet I would think that we would be spending more. So sort of just kind of like a basic history question, like, why did we stop spending so much after Apollo? Right, Apollo, we sort of won the space race, but like, why didn't we figure out new things to spend lots of money on? There are still big problems. Do we have a good explanation other than maybe, I guess we were worried about the budget or what have you? Anybody have an answer for that?
How do you jump in? I don't think there's a single uniform answer, but I definitely think part of what's going on, if you just look at when the United States was spending money and what was the cause or the instigator, the very first Sputnik moment, we talk about it as almost a metaphor now, but the very first one was a very literal Sputnik moment, and it was sort of this shadow of international competition that I think has historically driven the United States to really take itself seriously. And I think it's not an accident that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US kind of became complacent. We didn't really have an international competitor that we felt ourselves in either a military or even an economic competition with. We were on top of the world. We felt very secure in our position there. And so I think without some sort of pacing function, without another runner racing beside us, I don't think there was really the same incentive to keep spending.
And also to be very clear about what the Sputnik moment meant is that it was the moment in which intercontinental ballistic missiles and war between continents was possible. It was that moment. I think that we kind of forget this as well, that there is this military component to Sputnik, to the rest of the R&D culture that existed really from from 1957 onward. And that hit, at some point I think we should have a very kind of tight discussion about what Apollo meant and what moonshots meant when we use this part of the we've used this word very consistently within the conversation, and I'm hoping that we can talk very specifically about what that actually meant, right? What is it that we were trying to achieve with the moonshot, or specifically going to the moon? Why was it within that kind of cultural context? Why was it, why did it exist militarily, right? There's this military component, this weapons component. The United States did not have, at that time, it was failing with all of its missiles, right? In 1957, just months before Sputnik was launched, and before that also there was, again, intercontinental ballistic missiles that were launched a couple months before. The United States was failing at basically a missile that could go only like half that distance, and it became a international crisis because they realized that Russia, USSR had bombs, and they also had the means and the missiles to do it, and we did not. And so what that coalesced and what that created was this very interesting time, and I think it's an important conversation to have, is that interesting time between the military goals and then what then became later kind of the broader civilian goals of getting to the moon. So those two things are inherently tied together.
If I could add one brief footnote, and I will be quick. Will brought out a useful distinction between the defense R&D system and defense R&D budgets and civilian. And NIH has actually gone dramatically over that same period, over the past 50 years. But defense as a share of that portfolio has come down quite a bit. So we could talk about what the implications of that might be or might not be, if that's good or bad. Think about commercial dual-use spillovers and et cetera. But at least that's one way to get a little bit more insight into what sits inside that black box.
And to be very clear, so one other bigger point to all this is that yes, the military spending and federal share of R&D is going down, but the total percent of R&D per GDP, so like kind of the overall level, is at the highest that it's ever been. As was discussed in the previous panel, we're now at like 3.6% per GDP, and at the time of Apollo, it was about 2.6, 2.8. The entire nature of it has changed, which again, I think that's incredibly important. I think there's reasons why, for example, Bell Labs don't really work anymore in those sorts of systems of research. But I think it also puts a lot of emphasis as we talk about R&D, about the startup system and the startup ecosystem in the United States, how we fund this. There's a lot of new interest in trying to do hard tech issues. I know, Caleb's written extensively on this. We all have done really kind of, I think, important and kind of fundamental work to try to push that. But that as well is part of this conversation, right? That the American innovation and ecosystem looks very, very different than it did in the 1950s and 60s, post-war, all of that. And I think we need to embrace that and try to find the right policies to help help build that and help that grow.
But there is just, again, come back to you, Jim.
Feel free to jump in.
There still is no consensus. People talk about, 2.6% at some one point, and now 3.6 or whatever it is, another point. But there is no consensus yet about is there an optimum level? And I don't think there's going to ever be a consensus, because it depends on R&D is dependent on the needs of the nation, at least in part. I know my colleague Tony Mills is here. There are reasons for basic research and to discover to discover more about the universe and where we live. But the political and economic pressures change over time, and that doesn't give you an answer to how much we should be spending at a given moment on R&D, either federal or federal and private together. Excuse me.
It seems to me that's sort of where the debate is right now, or the changes that are happening. One, there's a big push to spend more. I don't know what that optimum level is, but there seems to be a lot of agreement that that optimum level has not yet been reached. And two, that we need to be spending this money differently. That while the economists seem to agree on basic research, the more sort of government intervention in that process, or the more controversial it becomes. So both those sorts of goals right now, which are one, spend more and have government to some degree take a greater role in directing how that money is spent. Let me jump to you again, Claude, but sort of where are we with that? How is that being filtered through the political process? Because so far it seems like it's very difficult to spend a lot more, and changing the mission, like the mission of the NSF, also seems pretty controversial. And again, I wonder how that can be sustained through a series of administrations. We'll start with Claude, then Dan.
Well, I don't think it can be sustained, and I think what we're facing really is the priorities beyond just R&D are going to increasingly impinge. And I think we're in a period, I should maybe have started with this, that we have moved from a period where there's skepticism about the federal government not going beyond basic R&D, but getting very much involved in development. We heard this morning the most articulate discussion of the role of government by the science advisor that I've ever heard. But you know, I start from the other end of this in terms of answering your question, and that is, yes, there's a role for government, but I start from the position of where is there market failure? Do you need to have the government intervene? I think the cast of mind this morning did not start from that. And that's a perfectly legitimate way to go. But I think we're in a time where that question is increasing, that is, the market failure question is increasingly less asked. And I think we will probably swing back in that direction at some point in the future, just as we did it in the past.
Well, I'll pick up from there because I'm an economist by training and by practice. And so I also see these problems through the lens of market failures. And there's the kind of, I would say, hand-wavy version of, we have a reason to believe that research is underinvested, or could be underinvested in by private markets, by the private sector. And so there's a role for government to fill gaps. Where is that particularly acute? Perhaps in basic research. But I think it goes beyond that too. There are, I've seen some of this in my own work, that there are categories of technologies where firms face intrinsic obstacles in, for example, establishing complex supply chains, coordinating investments across different firms that maybe aren't vertically integrated and have reasons not to be, matching technology to the needs of end users, and kind of coalescing this ecosystem, this value chain around emerging complex technologies, where sometimes, let's say, a guiding hand, and frankly, this is what a role that DARPA has played, for example, among other organizations, in certain specific emerging technology areas, where there can be value in, yes, I'll call it a bit of kind of industry coordination in nascent technologies. And so I see a bit more of an extension of the market failure paradigm to that in my work and in my read of the world, what that would be today. But the other piece I want to bring out here, getting back to the phrasing of Jim's question, is really how are priorities set? What are the priorities? How have they evolved over time? And here I think it's again useful to break apart the civilian and the defense sectors, because their priorities come about in very different ways. The Department of Defense has mission-driven priorities. If you think about everything from its basic research funding, the offices across the services, that are really investing in research that might be relevant to building and equipping the army of the future, 20 to 30 years from now, really long-term vision, versus more applied investments for larger in dollar value and intended over shorter horizons. That's one set of problems. But if you look over at, for example, the National Science Foundation, the National Science Foundation was created in the 1950s to fund basic research without immediate obvious applications, right? And because that's thought to be feedstock for technology development in ways that are hard to predict. And in that sense, the pieces are complementary, but their priorities are set in very different ways. The NSF is largely science governed by scientists, yes, with some politically appointed leadership, but at the end of the day, who does peer review, right? It's scientists and so on. And so the priorities in this sense come about from the ground up, but through different mechanisms based on the objectives and kind of the mission of the organization itself.
To me, I'm going to direct this to Caleb. To me, there's almost a surprising amount of skepticism about, even given the history of research spending, that we've had this pandemic where we sort of had business and government come together to create and then turn out and distribute this vaccine. And I guess I would have thought, whatever criticisms you want of that process, that it seemed to work and that it would be a powerful example, still relevant in American politics, that would suggest to policymakers, boy, we should do more of that. That worked great. So we have these two pretty good examples, and maybe in one, sometimes here we overlearn from the DARPA example. DARPA can't be for everything. But we have DARPA, which seems like an example of how government can be effective. Then we have Operation Warp Speed, a very recent, relevant example of how something beyond just pure research can be effective. And yet there seems to be an awful large amount of skepticism that we should have learned anything from Operation Warp Speed, and we should just sort of return to like a pre-OWS era. I'm not sure I had a question mark at the end of that, but I think you know where I'm going with it.
What's going on?
What
there
the heck is going on? Right, exactly.
I think there's several sort of overlapping problems. One is that sometimes we see firms that do invest in innovation and seem to be profiting from it, and we assume, oh, because there is a business model there, there must not be the need for any sort of public support. I think you saw this sort of around COVID, actually, is an interesting example. It was true that pharmaceutical companies did make some profits from investing in these vaccines. That doesn't mean that the social value that we put in terms of the advanced market commitments and the R&D upfront support that we provided a lot of these did not pay for itself 100, 1,000, 1 million times over. I think by any sort of normal accounting of that, every single day mattered, and each day that we were able to get the vaccine over the finish line earlier was just an absolutely huge public return. But people sort of see companies making money, and I think they intuitively get skeptical, and that's, I think, one reason for skepticism around public versus private sector R&D. The other thing is that I am so glad that Dan and his economic colleagues are trying to shine a spotlight on this, but finding the returns to innovation, especially public funding R&D, is actually quite hard, and it's only, I think, been recently that we've been able to get some better evidence on even the different kind of returns we get from public versus private sector R&D. There was a really good paper last year, Arnaud Duvenet, who looked at basically across different sectors of the economy. Whenever a federal agency starts increasing their R&D, how does that spill over into downstream patent applications and then to firm-level total factor productivity? And found that actually the public spillovers of public sector R&D were about 3 times larger in terms of their effect on firm-level productivity than even the private sector R&D. So it's kind of hard to measure, but all economists that have tried to look at this have basically come to the conclusion that it seems like the returns here are absolutely massive. And it's hard to sometimes predict which ones are going to work out and which ones aren't, but we know that in aggregate this portfolio seems to be producing a lot of returns. I think the other problem here is a little bit more political, which is that because science is hard to anticipate or predict what the downstream applications of it are going to be, it creates room for sort of political opportunism and skepticism. I think a lot of people are probably familiar with the now infamous example, I think in like 2011, where basically folks from the NSF were brought in and castigated for having funded a study where they were testing to see the speed of a shrimp on an underwater treadmill. And this became sort of a euphemism for wasteful public R&D dollars. Clearly, there's no conceivable reason why taxpayers should be spending this. But that totally misses the fact that science is really unpredictable. It's hard to know what the downstream applications are going to be. This is, I think, something that Vannevar Bush and others have articulated very well, which is that if we invest in kind of this curiosity-driven research, 30 years later you get really exciting applications like the mRNA vaccine. And certainly that would not have been possible without decades and decades and decades of public sector R&D. So I think there's kind of 2 forces of it being hard to measure the public returns to R&D and the fact that there's sort of political opportunism and being able to just call out the failure points and sort of wave them around as being examples of the overall portfolio. I think it's maybe not an accident that DARPA, a very successful model, when they have failures, those don't necessarily always come to light. We, in some sense, only get to see the positive applications, and yet we're very excited about those.
Will, on even... yeah, Claude.
No, go ahead.
No, please jump in.
I just think the example of COVID is not a very good example in the sense that, and in an earlier session we had here, our colleague Michael Strain used the COVID example as the one place in his mind that you really had a great defense of the government intervention. But there you had a specific technology goal. You created that vaccine over a year period, but it's not the same as trying to have a new industry or competing with other industries. You did it, the government got out, it handed it off. Now there could be criticism of what the companies got out of it, but it's not the same as an industrial policy, let's say for semiconductors or some other sector where you're trying to create or advance a particular sector which has many different modes and many different kinds of competition. So I think that doesn't make the point you could argue for, if we were to have another pandemic, that you could do that again. But that's not the same as saying that we ought to have a broad-based intervention of the government beyond, and we can get into definitions here, beyond basic research into applied or development, certainly in applied or development.
Well, that leads nicely into my question I was going to ask Will, which is sort of like on even days, I think, wow, maybe we can broadly pick certain sectors and figure out which. I mean, how hard is it to think like, wow, we should fund AI? That seems fairly obvious. Why don't we do more of that? But then on the next day, I'll think, carbon tax plus a little basic research, let's call it a day. Like, why? I mean, that is sort of a classic sort of center-right answer. Why is that? Do you think that is the right answer, sir? Where are you?
Yeah, so to add a little context and to add a couple elements which I think might help clear some of these questions. There's a kind of an extensive margin question when it comes to research and development, which is should we have a higher level of R&D, all things considered, right? And then there's another question, which is the intensive margin, which is that on the federally funded stuff, especially, how do we create the best programs that will be beneficial to as many people as possible, right? And those two things I think are constantly in tension. I primarily have been interested over the years really in this question of how do we make sure that the government grants that exist are doing a better job? How do we make sure that the programs that are already in existence, there have been cuts, the NASA and NSF and a whole bunch of these kind of primary agencies that are doing a lot of this work have faced cuts admittedly. But then there's this secondary question about how do we form the right kind of grant programs? Why is it that DARPA, for example, kind of works, right? That it is so successful, understanding why that project. So I think what you're asking on these different days, I think is really actually just fundamentally a question of, I mean, in the instance of DARPA and in some very, very specific projects, it seems that we can that government help and government research and government funding of a very specific narrow type can actually be quite impactful, right? There's a lot of examples of that, turbines and its effect on liquid natural gas industry and making that more efficient. That's been kind of a well-known example. We've talked about Apollo, and the reason I bring up Apollo very, very specifically is because when you look at Apollo, it is actually a relatively low, it's a high point of government funding, but it's a relatively low amount of funding, all things considered, for the entire economy. And I think that those two things are in tension, that you can have a relatively important project that can do important things, and it does bring attention. The prime example here is Operation Warp Speed, right? That it's a very high profile project that brings a lot of attention and can be done, but it's under very, very specific circumstances. So just to kind of build off what Claude was saying, but also what I think is probably the most important thing to take away from this is there are things we can actually do. I don't want to say they're low-hanging fruit, but there are things that we can do to try to get better federal funding, to understand how the agencies can do things well, to better understand the context of some of these projects that have been dynamic and powerful for local economies, and kind of build off that, right? I mean, there is still so much of the time of paper, like for example, on a grant making, which I think you actually wrote about, Caleb, something like half of all the time that's actually spent in that grant making process or for dealing with that grant is just purely on paperwork. Or it's like 46% or 45%, somewhere along those lines. But the point is that there is so much that goes into making those grants, that there's so much that goes into that process, the R&D process, that we really need to think much more critically about getting better, making it more efficient, thinking about, fast grants are another, I think, a really interesting model that also applies here. Figuring out how we can do this better, right? Figuring out how we can get permits better. It really is kind of a broader conversation about the efficiency gains that we could have of reforming government, of looking inward. And I think that we really should be focusing on that. And I'm hopeful that one of the goals of this this conversation, of this event, and future ones that we have kind of planned in all of this is the production of that.
Well, to answer your question, because this might actually fit your question, but it might not. So funding for basic research, a lot of people agree on that. And then sort of as you move to more intervention, the agreement declines. Like I love basic research, and boy, if there's some advanced geothermal company that needs a DOE grant for a pilot program, to me it seems like the Republic will still stand if we fund that. So where does your skepticism begin to increase as we move to more and more intervention? I'm not sure what's on the far side of that, but maybe you'll tell me.
This is a nice setup. So I want to take a step back and sort of think about, this is a very basic toy model, but sort of like a theoretical model for trying to understand how does this whole ecosystem kind of fit in and where along the point might you want to do different kinds of interventions. And again, this is not actually how it works, but for simplified purposes, I think it works. Imagine that on the one hand, you have sort of pure basic research, curiosity-driven. We know actually there's a lot of literature that when you try to sort of predict ahead of time how an investment in one particular area will lead to downstream applications, you're about just as often to produce an innovation in an adjacent area as the one you actually intended to. So in this very basic early end of the spectrum, it's incredibly hard to predict what the downstream applications are going to be, and that's I think where like the basic case for curiosity-driven research resides. I think the basic economist story is that there's huge market failures around sort of the creation and innovation of new ideas. We know if it's going to be 30 years downstream when you actually can take advantage of that, it's very hard for businesses, unless you have a monopoly like Bell Labs, to be able to actually justify investment in terms of that early stage of the pipeline. Way over on the other side, you have sort of like mass commercialized kind of applications that are sort of the pure advent of the market. And that's where we normally think about business development side of the R&D spectrum kind of relying. And then there's a pretty wide gulf between those. Economists who have tried to measure this look at somewhere between a 20 to 30-year lag, basically, between when you have the basic science kind of discovered and ready and when you actually start seeing wide-scale adoption and deployment of it within the commercial realm. And one way of thinking about a lot of the different kinds of mission-driven or technology-driven or place-based or military things, or they're basically trying to shrink that 20-year gap. There may be times when strategically we want to be able to say, hey, mRNA vaccines, they're kind of sitting on the shelf, but it'd be really, really useful if we could shrink the amount of time it would take to develop it. Instead of taking 10 years, we want it to take 1 year, and we're going to sort of put a lot of money to make that happen. Other times, the reason for sort of doing that space-time continuum is because of defense applications. We want to make sure that we have better drones than China, and so we're going to invest in kind of the area. Sometimes we think that there may be large social spillovers, like a malaria vaccine. The kinds of people that are primarily going to benefit from that can't actually signal through the market their willingness to pay because they're primarily people living in sub-Saharan Africa and they don't have a lot of purchasing power. And so we may, on a social realm, say that's a reason to kind of collapse that space-time continuum. But that's sort of my rough model for thinking about it, is we can spend a lot of money, and it's really useful to kind of continue developing that stream of basic science investments so that we actually have ideas we can pull from when it comes time to commercialize. And in the normal course of things, maybe it's totally fine to kind of let that 20-year timeline pay out, because there may be a lot of things it would not cost a cost-benefit analysis to try to shrink that for. But in particular cases, when there's a strong externality or market failure or social benefit that's not being captured, there can be a very strong public case, I think, for trying to make a targeted investment, whether it's through a DARPA or through a NASA kind of mission-driven agency, or through an advanced market commitment or an innovation prize, kind of the conceptual landscape of different kinds of...
What makes you uncomfortable?
Yeah.
Have you seen conversation about interventions that you're like, that's like a bridge too far?
So I think it's pretty case by case. So basically, like if there is a strong market failure or externality between why we need to sort of accelerate that timeline of a particular technology, then I'm going to at least be an open principle towards it. Like, let's run the cost-benefit analysis. Let's see if it works. But oftentimes, like there may be idiosyncratic reasons why a politician is excited about some technology, and there's not a clear market failure or externality. And I think I would be more skeptical.
Do you think there's a clear market failure or externality with having to have chip fabs in the United States?
So I think the main externality there, and sometimes this gets warped because politicians are actually trying to bundle a couple of different externalities at the same time, maybe strategically. And so sometimes we're talking
like
about
wanting more votes.
Potentially. There's obviously the national security, I think, externality is the most straightforward, kind of what happens if there's a war in Taiwan? Are we actually able to keep up our chip production? But sometimes this gets smuggled or bundled into other externalities like, we think there's externalities to having good jobs. Danny Roderick kind of talks about this. I tend to be intuitively a lot more skeptical of good job externalities and think we should try to sort of separate the specific margin of analysis of whether this is purely a national security case or purely a jobs case or political favoritism.
I think you have to realize we're living in Washington, and there are interest groups that see market failure everywhere who want the government to intervene. And to get back specifically to what you were just talking about, we had, a session here earlier where Scott Lincecum from the Cato Institute was here and jumped all over me because I said I would support, because even with reservations, I would have supported the CHIPS Act. And my point was one that was just mentioned, and that is I think it's just not a great idea to have 90% of the advanced chips produced in Taiwan, which is right off the Chinese mainland coast. And that to me was a legitimate rationale. And I said that knowing that, which I think is what we're seeing, getting back to the interest group, Congress was going to do all kinds of things that I would not agree with in the CHIPS Act. And we did, one of the things to make your point about how many new production facilities we need, manufacturing facilities and chips we need in the United States, that is still not clear. And there's going to be pressure to do more and more. And so I knew that was going to happen. It was going to be some sort of rolling of the dice there. But still, it made sense to me. The other side of that, though, and I would like to, I know you probably have other questions, but we've mentioned NSF. One of the things I think we should note is that I think it is, I don't think it's a dangerous turn, but I think it's unfortunate that you added a tech directorate to the National Science Foundation. And I will say I applaud Senator Schumer because his original bill in the so-called Endless Frontier Act that he started a couple of years ago would have changed the mandate of the National Science Foundation to the National Science Foundation and Science and Technology Foundation, and we ended up with a directorate. But I think the things that the bureaucracy and the civil servants who are quite good in the National Science Foundation are doing in the directory are very different from the kinds of things that NSF has done before. And I don't know whether any of you have seen, the Congress mandated that the NSF put together a so-called roadmap of how do you get forward, and the Congress had a group of 10 technologies. The NSF has now pushed this back because of budget questions to 4. But if you look at that roadmap, the bureaucrats in this part of the NSF really think of themselves as venture capitalists. They're talking about how do we invest in particular parts of technologies to advance U.S. competitiveness or to advance U.S. national security. My only point here is that I think this is something, it may be beyond any bureaucrat, but it's certainly beyond the civil servants who work in the National Science Foundation, and it also is beyond the normal. I think someone was talking about the peer reviews and the academic universe in which NSF normally works. It is beyond the kinds of things that this agency has done, and I think it is an unfortunate misdirection of at least part of the NSF. And I understand that basically still most of what NSF does is with basic research.
I had a question for you, but it sounds like you have a comment. So first I'll hear your comment, and then I'll see if I have a relevant question.
One undercurrent that I think has been present across this panel right now, and even in the earlier session, the fireside with Arati Prabhakar, is that all choices and strategies are going to present trade-offs. And if I am the CEO or CFO of a manufacturing firm, for example, I could increase my return on capital by keeping low inventories, right? It ties up little capital, but that leaves me exposed to supply disruptions. On the other hand, I could invest in keeping large inventories. It would depress ROI or ROIC, and yet that would build some resilience. And that's kind of one of the undercurrents in, I think, this conversation we had earlier, which is that there are different objectives that aren't necessarily fully aligned. They're in tension with each other. And if you tell me that one of our national objectives is to build more resilience because our global inputs are now at risk, that implies certain choices that may, let's say, run against prior paradigms that prioritized economic efficiency alone. And so those two things ultimately, I'm not the one who sets the objectives, of course. Congress and the president in concert do. But putting those two side by side, at least to me, helps clarify why we're even having this conversation in this moment.
I have a question. You can answer this, Dan, if anybody else wants to jump in. If you, it's kind of a big set aside, but just sort of setting aside the CHIPS Act. If I were to look at changes and funding to the rest of sort of the federal R&D establishment, including NSF, looking at that, would I think that we supposedly have this massive economic and military threat in China? Is that yet reflected? Because I would think it would be it might be, looking at the World War II example, it might be very easy to make the case for a lot more spending or huge changes, but are we actually seeing that those changes? We talk about them a lot, and there's lots of big plans to increase spending, but are we really seeing it?
In other words, has the threat really materialized yet? And if not, I think the corollary question is, are we ready for it? And I think more in terms of that latter question. If you go back to the World War II era, OSRD, this organization that was created, the agency created during World War II to manage civilian research into military technology, and the effort that Vannevar Bush led back then, we can argue several reasons why that was broadly pretty successful. Just like Operation Warp Speed at developing vaccines was, we think, pretty successful. But we're the think tank that likes vaccines. Yeah. Okay. Well,
we're a pro-vaccine.
Yes. Good. I'm glad to hear it. But one of the crucial inputs to both efforts was that there was knowledge on the shelf that was ready to be put to work. In both cases, science that was ready. Some science still had to be done, but for the at the time there wasn't really urgency. Didn't really allow for investments in long-term basic research. You took what was available and you ran with it. And when I think about preparedness for a future crisis, if we don't think the threat is materialized yet, if it does in 5 years, in 2 years, or in 10 years, it's about having the resources, those assets in place to build from. Fundamental knowledge, talented workforce with technical expertise in critical technology areas, institutions, even collaborative structures that can be triggered in a moment of need, things like this. And so, I mean, it's just as a matter of fact in daily existence, the threat hasn't materialized. We're not living through the middle of an economic or military crisis right now.
This is speculative to some degree, right?
At least I haven't read about it, right?
It doesn't feel very speculative.
I haven't checked the news today, but you tell me.
That's right.
But yes, I think as a matter of preparedness, it's very important.
I think it's partially, a matter of speculation or just seeing future trends. But like the single big advantage that China has over the United States is that they are 3 times our size. And there are a lot of ways in which like national might are correlated with just raw sheer population size. We know that the size of your economy really matters. It matters for your ability to dictate global trade terms. It matters for your ability to shape and steer innovation. And so the fact that China is working with a population 3 times ours is just a reason for us to, I think, stay on our game, even if so far it's been a little bit more theoretical.
And you could say that beyond that, they are also graduating more students in science and engineering than we are, substantially more students. And so in the long term, that's not something you change with one policy. It's something that over time we will pay a price for, it seems to me, in terms of your question of competition. I mean, and the larger thing is that we talk about the second Cold War. It's so different. I mean, the Soviet system was a sealed off system that wasn't working economically. Despite Xi Jinping and despite China's current problems, we are facing an economy, besides being 3 times as large, that actually is in the world economy and does compete. It may compete unfairly. There are all kinds of things that we should do against that. But it's a very different, not just in size, but in terms of what the population and what the government is and what the government is doing there, and the entrepreneurship within China.
I'll tack on one more quick thing, which is, I should have added earlier too, which is as a matter of preparedness, I think my read is the current weak spot is the industrial base, manufacturing in particular. A lot of that's been globalized and outsourced for even U.S. R&D performing firms. And if you look at past episodes like the World War II era, right, it wasn't just science and technology, but the ability to scale it up into mass production and to produce 100,000 radar systems and put them into practice. And this, in my view, is a bit of where modern currents in industrial policy particularly fit in, is having domestic capacity to be able to do that.
Right. I'm concerned that we won't be prepared to compete with China as we should. I'm also concerned that we're going to screw up like what we already do really well, which is basic research. So how concerned should I be on that latter point? That turning bureaucrats into venture capitalists, to changing the focus to technologies that can be commercialized sooner or used sooner, like that in that process, we'll stop doing well the thing we used to do very, very well.
I think it's definitely like a concern that we should keep in mind. I'm not too worried about it at current margins. I mean, the Technology Innovations and Partnerships Director at TIP is, I think, very cognizant of this trade-off, and they have been trying to be very thoughtful about it. And there's actually a lot of ways in which they can make complementary investments that help the rest of the NSF traditional investments kind of pay off. Like they have this interesting program, ART, Accelerating Research Translation, I think is the acronym. But basically they're investing in commercialization pipelines on university campuses and trying to see how we can level those up and make those more effective. If that investment pays off, then that's a way of making all the traditional basic investments that NSF is already investing in very effectively, even better. So I think it's something to be aware of and to be on guard for, and certainly we wouldn't want to let our advantage in basic science kind of slip, but I don't know that these need to necessarily kind of be at odds. I think the larger thing is that in the same way that we shouldn't feel complacent in the way that we did, post-1990s, just because we are better at basic science than a lot of the rest of the world today, doesn't mean that there's lots of ways we could not be doing much, much, much better. I think at a fundamental level, the way that we fund and structure science has not really changed that much since the 1950s or 60s. But we know that the underlying structure of scientific production has actually changed dramatically. As just one example, the economist Ben Jones and others have kind of documented the rise of team science, where no longer is it sort of one-off geniuses writing on their whiteboards coming up with massive innovations. It's actually huge teams of people. And if you look at proving the existence of the Higgs boson, requires a massive particle accelerator and a team of thousands of co-authors to basically be able to prove it. In contrast with, Albert Einstein, in the 1930s or whatever, sort of, on a whiteboard over a summer, coming up with 3 of the most fundamental papers in, modern physics. Like the structure of scientific production has changed a lot, but the institutions we use to structure science have changed very little, and I suspect that means that we're really under-optimized.
I'll say the number 1 response I get when I write about, we should spend more, will be like, can't we get more bang for the buck? Is it such a optimized, efficient system?
This is where actually, hopefully the two can go together. Like, I think a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. Our institutions are naturally very protective of what they have currently, and that's perhaps appropriate and optimal in a divisive political situation. But if you can increase funding, I think that actually increases the risk tolerance of these agencies to try new things, experiment, and that's been a big part of our focus as an organization, is trying to see what could you actually do to build these new institutions of science and kind of continue to make the current process work even better.
Okay, I think I'm supposed to go to questions now. I am going to keep that promise and indeed go to questions now. So if you have a question of relevance, and questions end in question marks and are not soliloquies about current events and around the world that have nothing to do with this topic, I would love to take a question or two. Does anybody have a question? I'm going to go with, there's a gentleman standing back there. So you get it because you were standing up, and I love the effort.
Terrific, thank you. Andrew Reamer, George Washington University. I'm actually going to tag on a question I asked in the earlier session regarding business-government collaboration and what we can learn from history regarding how the U.S. government has worked with business over the decades, and what can we learn from it. So one, and just 5 examples really quick, and then a question to you. 1830s, the U.S.
Did you say 5 examples?
National Academy of Sciences.
That's a lot of examples.
National Academy of Sciences, 1860. USDA working with farmers, 1860. The Morrill Act. Land-grant colleges were set up for universities funded by the federal government to work with manufacturers and farmers for research. That's 3. 1830s, the Harper's Ferry and Springfield Arsenals working with the private sector to figure out how to make things, and the U.S. manufacturing edge that blew Britain away was because of business-government collaboration around making muskets. And I'll save the 5th. So what can we learn from history regarding how business and government can collaborate regarding cutting-edge R&D?
Anybody would like to draw upon the lessons of history?
I mean, there's a lot of examples there, right? I mean, that's a quick, brief overview of nearly 200 years of this kind of relationship between government. A couple things here. One, I would say that I think that the world pre-1940-ish, right, or 1939, when there was mobilization efforts, as compared to what we now have, this kind of more modern system that's developed, especially since the 2000s. Those 2 things probably make the comparisons between how projects and products worked before as compared to now. I mean, I think there are lessons to be had in each one of those examples. But more fundamentally, figuring out what this means now and how we specifically collaborate, I think I mean, as we've kind of laid out, it has to be on a case-by-case basis. You're talking about, CHIPS Act looks very different than OWS, looks very different than, basically all the different projects that we might be talking about. So there can be lessons. I think those should be delved into. I think that there's a lot to be done there. There's a lot to be mined from there. But also to kind of answer a question that Jim had, one thing you asked was, should I be worried about this? Effectively, should I be worried about this system of innovation? And I think, yes, we're in a good position, but I think there are very clear reasons to be worried about the kind of American regulatory state and its relationship with the production of big business, right? There's a really, really big kind of anti-big business sentiment, and some of it is justified, right? What I'm talking about here are the cases against Amazon and Google and Apple and
they do a lot of R&D, those big businesses.
They do, and they do literally billions of dollars each year in this space. So I worry about that, right? That there are these. I mean, one, I think the CHIPS Act is. You also kind of took that off the table. The CHIPS Act are these kind of like one-off deals. I think need to be understood contextually. I've kind of, broadly my view about the CHIPS Act, which I think actually kind of is important to note, is that we probably could have done that for a much, much cheaper level. There's a lot of other things that were added on politically that made it feasible. And I think that's the conversation that especially really, that wonks really should care about. And I think that sort of.
That's part of the political process.
Yes, exactly. But how do we minimize?
About the CHIPS Act.
Yes.
Go ahead, sorry.
No, but that's kind of, those are fundamental elements of actually creating those projects, which we should be, at least have some kind of working consensus on understanding how these things came about. Therefore, when it does happen again, when we do have a new OWS, we kind of build on that. We know, okay, here's the way in which this system of product diversification, you go on multiple different lines for a vaccine, and it's that's what's really the kind of, among other things, that's what's really, really powerful here. So to me, there are many different lessons to be learned, but I would say the fundamental thing is that I think you really should be, and I think most people should be worried about this relationship, especially the regulatory state, with big business and how that kind of affects things, separate from the federal R&D and funding and grant process that we have going on.
That's a great point. Another question. Gentleman right there. I'm pointing to you directly.
Yes, my name is Roger Cochetti, and I want to thank the panel for beginning and really dwelling a lot on history of science research in the United States, because my question goes back to another historic example, and it's a contrary example to the ones that have been cited so far. By almost any measure, 1972 was the peak of the Cold War. There were shooting war in Vietnam between the United States and the Russians, shooting wars between the United States and Russians, proxies in Southern Africa, Middle East, South America, and yet at the height of the Cold War, the most anti-Russian president we probably ever had, Richard Nixon, signed an agreement with Kosygin of Russia for Apollo-Soyuz. And he spectacularly showed that that science cooperation was above geopolitics. There was an area that was so visionary that we could cooperate. Now, obviously, the Russians could have slit the American astronauts' throats or bombed the Apollo part of it, but the point I'm getting to is that if we compare then with today, when the most anti-Russian president in our history would cooperate in a spectacular example of pure science cooperation, it is my impression that we cannot cooperate with Russia today on planetary defense. We cannot cooperate with them on climate change. We cannot cooperate with them on pandemic research. That international cooperation with our adversaries in pure science is today off the table. But is there any area where we should today do what Richard Nixon did at the peak of the Cold War and said, no, there's an area of science where we can cooperate with our adversaries who are killing us in Vietnam the same day we signed the agreement. So I don't know if there's any area where we can cooperate in pure science with our adversaries, but if there is, I'd ask people, panel to talk about it.
Can we work with the Russians, the Chinese, the Canadians, our greatest adversaries?
I think one challenge is that it's become more like legible or known to the international community, the relationship between scientific development and military prowess. And so as kind of the dual use nature of a lot of technologies becomes very apparent, it becomes harder to collaborate on things like AI because you never know when that might lead you to have a more superior military. I would love to see more international scientific collaborations, and maybe when you're still within this like very basic space, it becomes easier. I think the other place where you could definitely imagine more collaboration is in technologies or research areas where it's very obvious that there's no military applications. And so things like climate change seems useful. Like how can we really continue to push down the cost curve on different kinds of technologies that would make it profitable to deploy all across the world so that we don't have to have this trade-off between energy abundance and kind of carbon emissions. You could also see a way, and actually without deliberate collaboration that has been happening. I mean, especially like Chinese really driving down the cost of solar panel manufacturing has enabled a lot of really cool applications all over the world. That wasn't an intentional kind of collaboration, but has kind of come about. The other area where I would love to see more international collaboration, and there has been some, is on the global health side. Again, I think there are so many just obvious biomedical technologies or vaccine targets that we could be deploying to save millions of people all around the world, don't have obvious military applications, but are just being really underfunded right now.
The dual use nature of what you're talking about with space, I think, is a very that's important to point out, and that's the reason I mentioned ICBMs at the very beginning. That's it. The dual nature of it, the dual use nature of it, I think makes it a very potentially problematic area, right? It's an area where you could have, as the Russians did, from my understanding, in those collaborations, that was how they got. Inlays in order to actually steal plans for what became the STS. I could be misremembering this history, but there was collaboration that actually did have spillover effects that seemed to be pretty negative, at least at that time. But that is primarily just because of the nature of space, right? These are rockets. These are fundamentally weapons, right? They really, truly are. But then again, within that context, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think Caleb is completely right about the kind of non-military use spaces. I would say specifically about space, China, and this is one of the things that I've been trying to do more work around and bring more attention to. China has very specific strategic ambitions for space in a way that I don't think the United States has really ever come, to grips with. One of the things we were talking about potentially with this is, the Apollo mission, what the Apollo mission means today, right? And I think what is that we need to do a good job of managing NASA, right? There are currently astronauts that are currently stranded in space. And that's not a
Delayed.
Delayed. Yeah, 2025, February 2025. The fact that it is not on the news every single night, that yet again, we have a failure of a massive project that was predicted to be pretty bad, right? It's not as though you haven't seen this happening with Starliner. It's not as though you haven't seen it with this sort of space project. All that's to say is that management of these things, when we do them well, I think is far, far, far more important. And specifically managing of these large projects is critical to understanding and kind of making those strides, but within this kind of national security framework.
All right, well, I hope we've informed your perspective on science and innovation policy. Thank you very much for coming.
That was fun.
Yeah.